The drifter arrives. The cowboy came in from the east like the wind had carried him across half a continent and set him down just outside the edge of town. He rode a sway-backed gelding that moved with the weary gait of an animal used to covering miles without rest. His boots were splitting at the seams, the leather dry and peeling as if it had seen too many summers without oil. Dust clung to his coat in thick patches, the kind of ground-in earth that didn't come from a single day's ride, but from years of travel under an unforgiving sun. He sat the saddle like a man who'd been born in it, loose in the hips, steady in the shoulders, the posture of someone who had learned early how to survive both the trail and the company of hard men. The town noticed him, but only in the way people notice the weather as something that will pass through and be gone. They'd seen enough drifters with eyes like his, quiet, watchful, and layered with the weight of past lives no one dared to ask about. No one waved. No one called his name. He didn't offer it. It was on the steps of the post office that an old drunk swaying on unsteady legs and smelling of bad whiskey told him about work. The widow out past Split Rock was hiring hands. The pay was nothing to write home about, not that anyone in town was doing much of that, but the work was steady and there was food enough to keep a man upright. Biggest spread north of the Pecos, the drunk slurred, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. Though you wouldn't know it looking. Dry-boned land looks like it's been dying a decade. But she's got reach, that one. Owns more than the bank can count. Wace didn't ask what kind of work it was, or why a woman with that much land needed to hire strangers. Some things were better learned slow. He gave the drunk a nod, stepped back into the stirrups, and turned the gelding toward the west. By the time the sun began to fall, painting the hills in burnt orange, he could see the dark outline of Split Rock in the distance, the first shadow of a place that would not let him leave the same man who'd arrived. First impression of the widow's ranch. The light was going soft when Whis reached the widow's spread. From a distance, it looked like every struggling ranch he'd ever seen, a long house made of weathered oak with a roofline sagging under years of wind, a barn leaning toward collapse at the southern end, and a corral holding 3 mustangs too wild in the eye to have been properly broken. The land itself was parched, the grass brittle and sharp under the hooves of his gelding. No laughter, no music from the house, only the faint creak of wood in the breeze. She didn't wait for him on the porch or behind a curtain. She stood in the dirt, arms crossed the butt of a shotgun resting casually against her hip. The duster she wore had once belonged to a man, though the way it hung over her shoulders made it hers entirely. Beneath it, the hem of her dress was the color of ash, worn to threads at the edges. Her hair was pinned up her face, lined not from age alone, but from weather smoke and something harder to name. Her eyes didn't flicker when they found him, just held steady, weighing him the way you might weigh a horse before a trade. "You come for work?" she asked. I did. Got a name he considered lying the way a man does out of habit when a stranger with a weapon asks. Thought better of it. Whis is enough. She didn't blink, didn't nod. Just let the silence run long enough for him to feel the grit settle in his teeth. Then she tipped her chin toward a low building in the distance. Bunkhouse is that way. You'll start with fence posts. North line's gone soft calves slipping through. Lose another IDOC pay. Supper's at 7. Don't expect a bell. That was all. No handshake, no welcome. She turned away before he dismounted, and Whis felt without knowing why that he'd just stepped into something deeper than the job he'd come for, silent work, and strange observations. The first 3 weeks at Split Rock moved in a quiet rhythm, mending fences under a rising sun, hauling water from the creek bed that cut through the pasture, clearing dead wood that had been left to rot for seasons. The widow spoke only when necessary, her words clipped and precise. Hatch, the foreman, was a barrel-chested man who made sure the work stayed on schedule. Between them and the other 3 hands, there was no space for talk that didn't serve a purpose. Wise kept his head down but his eyes open. He noticed the supply wagons that came heavy loaded with goods far beyond what a ranch with this few cattle would need. He watched strangers approach the outer fence and tip their hats. Not just the hands, but riders from counties over men who carried themselves like they knew exactly whose land they were passing. Every 3rd Wednesday the sheriff came alone, handed the widow a slip of paper without dismounting, and rode off without a word. At dusk, Wiss would see her on the porch, eyes sweeping the far hills. Not like she was admiring the sunset, more like she was searching for movement, calculating distance, keeping score in a war that hadn't started or maybe had never ended. No one told him what it meant. No one told him anything at all, but he knew enough to recognize the shape of something bigger than cattle and fences. And when a man learns to live by watching, he learns when he's standing on the edge of a truth that other people will kill to keep quiet. Learning the widow's reputation. It was a night like most others, the sky black as coal, the air sharp enough to sting his lungs. Whiz sat at the long table in the bunkhouse, with a tin cup of black coffee cooling at his elbow, the sour bite of it settling into his stomach. Hatch was across from him, eating slow from a plate of beans and stale bread, his eyes on the food rather than the man across from him. Wiss broke the silence. How long's she been running this place since her man passed? Hatch chewed and swallowed before answering, eyes never lifting. Going on 10 years now. That long all on her own. The foreman's lip twitched, not quite a smile, not quite a warning. Ain't on her own. She's got interests. Wiss raised a brow. What kind that was when Hatch's eyes met his. There was no friendliness there, just a hard, flat look that said the line had been reached. Best not to ask Wiss. The words sat between them like a weight. Wise leaned back, taking another sip of coffee, letting the silence close over the subject. But in his gut, he felt the same itch he'd carried into more than one back room in his time, the sense that the surface story wasn't the truth. Over the next days, he watched more carefully. The ranch hands weren't cowed by hard work. They were cowed by her. Not in the way men pity a widow clinging to what's hers, but in the way they lower their heads for someone whose reach stretches further than they want to imagine. There was power in the way she moved across her land, a quiet kind that didn't need to raise its voice, and Wiss knew from years of drifting that power like that wasn't born from kindness. It came from holding the line no matter how much blood it took to do it. Discovery in the North Ridge. By the 2nd month, the widow started trusting Wiss enough to send him out alone on the fence line. Or maybe she didn't trust him at all. Maybe she was testing to see if he'd wander where she didn't want him. Either way, one late afternoon found him riding Cutter, his gelding up into the northern ridges. The land there turned sharp and mean, the kind that didn't give second chances. From the high ground, the valley rolled out in folds of red dirt and dry grass, the horizon broken only by the shadowed lip of a canyon that didn't appear on the old county maps. Curiosity got the better of him. He rode down into the canyon, following a narrow path carved by hoof prints that hadn't seen rain in months. The air was still the kind of quiet that presses on the ears. And then he saw it, a corral far larger than the one near the main house, holding 50, maybe 60 head of cattle. The brand on their hides wasn't the widow's mark. It was a broken horseshoe over a bar burned deep into the skin. His stomach tightened. This wasn't some stray herd waiting to be driven to market. It was hidden stock kept out of sight, the kind of thing men kill to protect. He turned back before the sun hit the rim of the canyon. The ride home felt longer than it should have, the shadows stretching ahead of him. That night he asked Hatch about the cattle. "We only run a dozen fars, I've seen," Whis said, voice even. "You been to the North Range lately?" Hatch's jaw flexed. Without a word, he dumped his plate into the wash bucket and walked out into the dark. That was answer enough. The widow wasn't scraping by on a dying ranch. She was sitting on a hidden kingdom, and every man around her was either too afraid or too bought to speak of it. The widow's past. It was well past midnight when Hatch finally told him the rest. The bunkhouse was dark except for the glow of a single oil lamp shadows crawling along the rough plank walls. The other hands were asleep, their breathing slow and steady. "She was 17, Hatch began, voice low. "Married off to a bastard of a man from one of the richest families in the territory. Meanest son of a bitch you ever heard of. Beat her till her face broke. Sheriff never touched it. His people ran half the county. Whis didn't interrupt. One night the house burned. Folks said 'twas an accident, but those of us here, we knew better." She walked out with a broken hand and the deed in her dress. 2 days later, she gave him a Christian burial, didn't wear mourning, never kept his portrait above the hearth. Hatch's eyes met his, the lamplight cutting deep lines into his face. "I helped bury him." After that, there was nothing to say. Whis lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, thinking of the way she carried herself, not like someone clinging to what was left, but like someone who had been through fire and decided to become it. By the time the morning came, he understood at least one thing, whatever this land meant to her. She would hold it with teeth and iron until the day it killed her, defending the land. 2 mornings later, she came to him at dawn. No greeting, no explanation, just a rifle in her hand and an order. "Ride west with me." They took a wagon along the ridge road, the wheels crunching over rock and scrub. The air was dry enough to split lips, the sun rising slow but heavy, promising heat that would choke the day. She didn't speak for nearly an hour, just kept her eyes fixed ahead. When she finally pulled up the reins, they stood at the edge of a stretch of nothing, bare earth hammered with a line of stakes, each topped with a rag of faded cloth. "That's Baird's," she said, her voice flat. Whis scanned the hills. No cattle, no fences worth claiming, just dust and old bones. Doesn't look like much. "It's mine," she said. Or so he thinks. And the courthouse in his pocket. Judge, too. So we redraw the lines our way. They worked side by side, planting new fence posts deep and capping them with iron. The ground was stubborn, sun-baked hard, but she didn't slow. She carried a revolver on her hip the whole time, and when the sound of hoofbeats came from the south trail, she stepped forward without hesitation. The rider was young, too clean to be a drifter. He reined up when he saw her eyes flicking from her to Whis. "You got 3 seconds to turn around," she told him, her tone cold enough to strip the heat from the air. He hesitated, spat into the dirt, and wheeled his horse without another word. They didn't speak of it on the ride back, but Whis understood now this wasn't petty land squabbling. This was a war that had been brewing for years, and she had no intention of letting anyone write the ending but her. Quiet expansion. Spring bled into early summer. The ranch began to change in ways a casual eye might miss. A second bunkhouse went up near the east pasture. New hands arrived in 2s and 3s men with the quiet, coiled manner of ex-soldiers, and others who looked like they'd been running from something for a long time. None asked questions. None gave more than a first name. Wise found himself promoted without anyone saying the word. She began asking his opinion, not often, but enough for him to know it mattered. He was invited to supper in the main house from time to time. Inside, the walls smelled faintly of smoke and old cedar. She never drank, never removed her coat, even when the heat pressed in like a wet blanket. One night, lightning cracked over the valley, and rain pounded the roof like fists. The fire in the hearth threw jagged light across her face as she sat with her hands folded on the table. "My husband's family owned 3 counties cotton cattle oil," she said, not looking at him. "He was the youngest, weakest, meanest of them. They gave him me like a dowry. You kept the land," Whis said. "I kept everything. You think they're still watching? They've been watching this whole time, just waiting for me to die slow or get soft." She met his gaze. "You don't strike me as soft." The flicker of a smile there and gone. Whis didn't say it aloud, but he knew whatever she was building here, it was bigger than a ranch. She was digging in for something far worse than drought or bad cattle prices. She was building a fortress. First blood. The first blow came without warning. Lyle, the youngest hand on the ranch, barely tall enough to fill his boots, rode out one afternoon to check the south fence and didn't come back. By sundown, his horse wandered in near the ravine reins, dragging saddle empty. Whis Hatch and 2 others went searching the sun bleeding out of the sky as they scoured the canyons. They found him hanging from a mesquite tree, stripped of his boots and gun. His mouth was stuffed with dirt, and pinned to his chest was a splintered piece of iron shaped like a broken horseshoe. They cut him down without a word. Hatch's knife, usually reserved for finer work, made the slice. No prayers, no curses, just a grim silence that felt heavier than shouting. That night, the widow stood in the rain, her coat plastered to her shoulders, her face unreadable as they lowered Lyle into the ground. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. The next morning, she summoned Whis into the long house. A map was unrolled on the table, marked in grease pencil and dark ink. "They're testing us," she said. "Baird's men, not locals. Hired. Might be Southern, might be Pinkertons. What do you want from me?" She tapped a point on the northern ridge. "There's an old watch station up there, abandoned since the rail pulled out. I want eyes there. Yours." By week's end, Whis was living out of a tent on the rich rifle across his lap, watching the valley through glass. And what he saw convinced him the killing wasn't an accident, it was an opening move. The enemy's tactics from the ridge. Wise learned more about Baird's men than any scout report could have told him. These weren't rustlers or ranch hands on a bad streak. They moved in disciplined arcs, never alone, always with a partner covering their flank. Their formation shifted like they drilled it 100 times, too clean for chance, too deliberate for anything but training. He saw them ride low through the grass to cut water lines. He watched them drag heavy sacks to the river bank, spilling something dark into the current poison, no doubt. More than once, he tracked the thin plumes of smoke curling from the south pasture supply caches going up in flames before the ranch could use them. They didn't want to fight yet. They wanted to thin the herd, choke the land until it buckled. Twice he sent word back to the widow. Twice his messengers didn't return. On the 13th day, he decided to ride back himself. The ranch looked different. The north fence had been doubled, new trenches cut across the south pasture. Hatch limped from a fresh bullet wound in his thigh. One of the bunkhouses had burned down to its frame. The air still carried the tang of charred timber and something sharper, fear masked poorly by smoke. She was waiting in the barn, sleeves rolled to the elbow, cleaning a rifle under lamplight. He handed her the report without speaking. "You were right," he said. "I usually am. They're not coming to bargain." She looked up at him, eyes steady. "I stopped believing in bargains the day they buried my sisters in a ditch for refusing marriage." The words dropped heavy in the air, not for pity, but for the certainty in them. Wyss realized then this wasn't just about land. It was legacy and war woven into one, building alliances. Before dawn, she handed him a ledger. Old debts, names, places. Some still owe me. Some owe my late husband's family. Some just hate Baird enough to listen. He took it without a question. His task wasn't to fight, not yet, but to recruit. In Rust Creek, he found a former sheriff whose badge had been bought and retired by the same men Baird now employed. The man owed the widow a favor from decades back, the kind you don't forget. He came without hesitation. Down in Harlan County, Wyss tracked a gang of ex-rail guards. Their leader recognized the widow's name as one once whispered on wanted posters. That alone was enough to bring them north. Some he tempted with gold, others with land, but most came for something simpler, the satisfaction of striking back at the same kind of men who'd taken from them. By the time Wyss returned 3 weeks later, 16 riders followed him. They brought a munitions cart, extra rifles, and a letter from a judge in Iron Hollow, offering to falsify deeds in the widow's favor. She read everything without expression. When she was done, she placed a hand on his arm just once. "You've done more in a month than my own kin did in 10 years. That night, she called the ranch hands and new allies to the main yard. No cavalry, no marshal, just them. "We strike first," she said, standing before the fire like it was a pulpit. "Not because it's right, because if we don't, they will salt this land and piss on our graves." No one argued. First, strike. They rode at midnight. The wind came down from the ridges in a long, low howl, swallowing the sound of their hooves. A dozen riders split into 2 wings, moving fast and low across the dry basin toward Baird's forward camp. No torches, no shouts, just the dark, pressing in the dust curling off their horses' legs. The camp was larger than Wyss expected, a ring of canvas tents, a cook fire still smoldering, 6 guards posted with rifles, but the men were lazy, maybe drunk. The first guard dropped without a sound, a single shot punching through his chest. The second had his throat opened before he could raise an alarm. The rest woke in chaos, boots half-laced, grabbing for weapons they'd never get to use. One fled on foot. They let him go. The message would travel faster if it came from a survivor. They burned the supply piles, crates of dry goods, powder, and something heavier in weight, but wrapped in oilcloth. Ammunition, enough to choke the widow's ranch for months. Flames lit the basin in a low red glow, smoke climbing into the stars. By dawn, they were back at Split Rock. Through his spyglass, Weiss saw Baird's banner flying half-mast above the man's main house, Blackfield Red Bull Broken Arrow. The widow didn't smile, didn't celebrate. She only said, "Now we see what he does when the fire's in his blood." Retaliation. It came on the 6th night after the raid. No warning, no shouts on the wind, just the sudden sound of horses in the dark. And then the blaze. Weiss woke to screaming, and the glow of fire cutting through the cracks in the bunkhouse wall. By the time he grabbed his boots, the west pasture was an inferno. Horses shrieked in the smoke, their silhouettes thrashing against the flames. 2 men were down before Weiss had even chambered a round. The air reeked of burning hay, singed hair, and something acrid quicklime. Baird's riders moved like ghosts' faces, masked their blades catching firelight as they cut fence lines and slashed feed sacks. They didn't linger. By the time Weiss put a bullet in the last one within range, the others had vanished into the canyons, leaving destruction in their wake. The widow stood in the center of it all, barefoot rifle in hand, her dress streaked with ash. One of her dogs lay still beside her, smoke curling from its fur. She didn't speak when Weiss came to her side. He saw in her eyes not shock but the deep simmering anger of someone who had already calculated the answer to the question. What now? By morning the water from the main well was poisoned. Cattle in the south pen panicked and broke through the fence. 3 ranch hands quit by nightfall, and one, a man who'd been at the ranch longer than Weiss, set fire to the smaller bunkhouse before disappearing into the hills. The damage was deeper than bodies and buildings. Fear was settling in like rot. Weiss could see it in the way the men spoke, less in how they jumped at shadows, in the fact that no one met the widow's gaze unless they had to. The siege. The widow didn't waste time on mourning. That night she called every man left to the smokehouse, a building with no windows and walls thick with years of salt and brine. Weiss stood by the door as her allies filed in, bounty men, rail guards, a few former lawmen who had long since traded badges for pay and lead. She stepped into the center of the room with a map in her hands, but it wasn't of her land. It was of Baird's, his ranch, his roads, his mines. "We're not holding this land," she said. "We're taking theirs." Gasps, a few low curses, then silence. What followed wasn't battle, not the kind the army would recognize. It was siege by 1,000 cuts. Every night they hit a different piece of Baird's holdings. One night they set a warehouse ablaze. Another they cut a section of rail. Fences went down. Guards vanished from their posts. Supply wagons turned up overturned and burning in dry gulches. The point wasn't territory. It was time, blood, and fear. Rumors began to spread of a ghost widow on horseback who fed the coyotes with men's bones. The first time Weiss heard it, he almost laughed. But he stopped when he saw the men telling it, hands, shaking eyes, darting, speaking low, like they feared she might be listening. It wasn't just her wrath they feared. It was the quiet in it, the final battle. By the end of the month, Baird's supply lines were in tatters, his northern fences nothing but scattered posts, his cattle scattered across no man's land. And yet he held the manor. Weiss knew why the man was drawing them in. He tried to tell her. "We've got the high ground," he argued. "Starve him out, make him come to us." But she shook her head. "He doesn't beg. He buries. If I wait, he'll hire more and dig in deeper. I go now, or I lose everything." The next morning she armed every man and woman on the ranch. New rifles, fresh powder, iron rounds. She told them once, "Tomorrow we ride into his valley and to his teeth." Some of you will die. If you want to leave, do it now." No one moved. They rode under a blood-red dawn, not as ranch hands or hired guns, but as something older vengeance given flesh. The air in the valley was still as a graveyard. The manor rose ahead 3 stories of pale stone and iron, the windows dark. They dismounted 50 yards out. Whiz stepped to her side. "This isn't right," he murmured. "He's waiting," she said. The crack of a rifle from the roof answered them. A man beside Whis fell, his blood spraying across the gravel. Then the valley erupted in gunfire. Hidden pits in the field disgorged men with rifles. The kill box closed around them. Baird had planned for this, but so had she. Breaching the manor. The first volley shook the air, splintering the cedar posts around them. Men dropped into the dust, scrambling for cover behind stone outcroppings and the blackened trunks of old oaks. Whis shoved the widow behind a low wall, the heat of lead snapping past his ear. "He planned for this," Whis growled. "I know," she said, eyes steady face, as calm as if she were watching a storm from her porch. "Push anyway." She gave the signal. The first wave broke from cover, drawing fire as they cut across the open ground. Whis took 6 riders wide to the east wall, moving low until they were close enough to smell the smoke from the chimneys. He lobbed 2 bottles of oil and cloth into the upper windows. The fire caught quick flames leaping to the curtains. Screams followed. The second wave hit the gates hard, a stolen steam cart from the rail yard at their head. It smashed through the iron with a screech, tossing splinters and twisted metal into the courtyard. Baird's mounted men tried to rally black dusters, snapping as sabers flashed, but the widow's allies weren't cattlemen. They were killers, disciplined and mean. The fight turned brutal and close. Whis's rifle jammed. He drove a fence picket into the neck of a man who charged him, feeling the spray of warm blood across his coat. Through it all, the widow moved down the gravel path, coat trailing smoke, shotgun steady. She didn't run, didn't crouch, didn't flinch when a bullet grazed her sleeve. She walked straight to the front doors of the manor, as if the gunfire around her were nothing more than the rattle of summer cicadas. Baird's death. The heavy doors swung open, and there he was, Baird himself. White beard matted with sweat, a silver pistol in his hand. A dozen men flanking him, his voice carried over the chaos. "You think you can take this from me?" She didn't answer. She just raised the shotgun and fired. The blast tore through his shoulder, spinning him sideways. His men shouted, firing wildly, but Whis was already on the porch, taking one in the chest with his last round and tackling another into the door frame. Baird crawled, blood soaking his coat, one hand reaching toward the boot sheath for a hidden blade. The widow stepped over him, kicked him onto his back. "You can't," he rasped. "I built this." "You stole it," she said. "I'm just taking it back." She shot him in the mouth. The sound rolled through the valley like thunder, the echo hanging in the air, even as the fighting sputtered into silence. Whis stood over the bodies, breath-ragged hands, slick with blood that wasn't all his. When it was over, they sat on the porch steps, the manor burning behind them. The survivors moved like shadows, pulling the wounded out, stacking the dead in the yard. The widow's hair had come loose streaks of ash in it. She said nothing. Neither did Whis. They watched the sun push up over the hills, its red light cutting through the smoke like a promise kept at terrible cost. Aftermath of victory. By nightfall, the manor was nothing but black stone walls and collapsing beams. The smell of wet ash clung to everything. Hatch lay in the barn, gut shot and fading. Half the men they'd ridden in with were dead. The widow walked through the ruin barefoot, dress torn, a long gash down her arm seeping through the bandage. She moved like someone taking inventory, her gaze passing over bodies, burned door frames, shattered glass, not mourning, not gloating, just measuring what conquest looked like. Back at the ranch, the survivors worked without orders. They dug anew well-rebuilt fences, stacked what little supplies they had left. The widow's banner, a broken horseshoe hammered straight, now flew openly from a cedar pole above the barn. She'd won. The county knew it. But she spoke less now, even to Wyss. One evening he brought her a flask. She didn't drink. "I came here looking for work," he said quietly. "You found it," she replied. "I stayed because I thought you'd lose. You were wrong." He looked at her hands, still faintly stained with Baird's blood despite days of scrubbing. "You ever let it go?" Her eyes flicked to his. "No. But I let it lie." She stood then, disappearing into the long house, leaving him alone on the porch. The war was over, but the air still felt charged, like the land itself was holding on to the last sparks. Years later, in the months after the manor fell, the courthouse in Dustville sent word she was now the legal owner of 400,000 acres, 6 wells, 2 mines, and every waterway between Barrow Ridge and the Singing Hills. The papers came with signature seals and all the trappings of legitimacy, but Wyss knew she'd owned it the moment Baird's body hit the gravel. Lawyers came to buy her out their boots too clean for the dirt roads they traveled. She sent them away with wagons, stripped of wheels, their threats falling useless in the dust. Couriers brought deeds and maps, which she signed without ceremony and tossed into a drawer she never locked. She never remarried, never took a lover. She rode the land with Wyss at her side until the day her breath left her. When it happened, there was no announcement, no gathering. Wyss buried her on the edge of the high pasture, the place where wild horses still came to drink at dawn. He carved the stone himself. No name, no dates, just 3 words chiseled deep enough to outlast weather. She owned everything. The county changed after that. People called it the widow's county without thinking, though. Half the young ones didn't know the story behind it. Roads widened, fences grew stronger. Her mark, once a desperate scratch on stolen cattle, became law. Wyss stayed. His beard grayed, his voice roughened, his back bent with the years. He kept the long house exactly as she'd left it, her boots on the porch, her rifle above the door. He handled the grain shipments, argued over water rights, stared down bankers when they got curious. But something in him had gone hollow, like an echo, with no canyon left to bounce off of. Her legacy. Every morning, Wyss walked the perimeter of the ranch alone. The dogs no longer followed him. They seemed to know he was walking more for the memory than for the work. He'd stop at the high pasture stand by her grave and watch the light shift across the land she'd fought to keep. He didn't speak much anymore. Nights passed in the glow of a single lamp, the ledger she'd once handed him, still in its drawer. He read through the names, most of them crossed out debts paid in coin or blood. Sometimes he'd catch himself tracing the indent of her handwriting with his finger. The ranch still ran. Cattle branded with the straightened horseshoe grazed in the lower fields. The wells never ran dry. The men who worked the land now didn't ask about the widow. To them, Wyss was the one who gave orders, signed wages, kept the gates locked. But he never pretended the land was his. It still felt like hers, like the air carried her breath, the soil held her blood. One spring, He saw a storm sweep in from the west, dark clouds swallowing the sun. The smell of rain hit the air sharp and clean. For a moment, standing there with his coat collar up against the wind, he almost expected to hear her voice beside him, low and certain. Hold the line, the next generation. It was in the middle of that spring when the girl arrived. 17, maybe 18. Not local. Her clothes were a patchwork of 3 counties stitched where they'd torn dust ground into every seam. There was fire behind her eyes, the kind that didn't come from youth alone, but from surviving something that should have broken her. She walked her horse into the yard and looked at him without hesitation. "I'm looking for work," she said. "I can ride. I can shoot. I can read numbers. Don't care about the pay." We studied her for a long moment. "Got a name? Call me Maroro. You from here, no? You running?" She held his gaze. "Not anymore." He pointed toward the bunkhouse. "Stalls are clean, beds are dry. Start tomorrow." Weeks passed, and she worked like stone quiet, capable, never complaining. She didn't flinch when the rains hit hard or when 2 men came sniffing around with questions and left limping. Whis watched her like he was trying to place a shadow he'd seen before. One evening he found her near the high pasture, standing with her hat in her hands, head bowed toward the grave. "You know who she was?" he asked. Maroro nodded. "I heard stories. Some say she was a killer. Some say she was a queen." "They're both right," Whis said. "They also say she took in runaways. People with nothing." "Oh, she did." Maroro looked at him, a question hanging in her eyes. "You think she'd take me?" Whis let the silence stretch. Then he said, "She already did. You're here, ain't you?" They walked back toward the bunkhouse in silence, the dusk pulling long shadows across the pasture. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes yipped the sound, carrying over the quiet land. Hers still even now, the inheritance of fire. The war was long over, but the land still bore its scars, fence posts that didn't quite match patches of earth, where nothing grew, and a silence that hung heavier in certain corners of the pasture. Whis had grown used to that quiet. It was the kind you didn't break without reason, the kind the widow herself had carried in her wake. But with Maroro around, the air felt different. Not lighter exactly, just restless. She moved through the ranch like someone born of it, though. Whis knew better. Her hands carried the marks of rope burn and callus from somewhere else. Her eyes tracked the horizon like she expected trouble to show there first. And when it did, a sick calf in the far pen, a stranger asking for water, who didn't mean well, she met it head on, without looking back for orders. Whis didn't say it out loud, but he recognized the shape of her, in the same way you recognize the shape of a storm by the wind before it breaks. She wasn't the widow. She didn't have to be. The land had a way of bending people toward its will, and it was already working on her. One evening, the sun bleeding orange across the western hills, Whis found her sitting on the porch steps where the widow once sat. The light caught her face in a way that made the years slip from his eyes, not because she looked like the woman buried in the high pasture, but because she held herself the same way, like someone who had decided long before that nothing was going to take from her what she'd bled to keep. "You keep walking the fence line like it's a church aisle," she said without looking at him. "Old habit," he replied. "That habit keep her alive for a while," Whis said. "Long enough to make the land hers." Maroro's gaze followed the fence line toward the horizon. "Think it'll ever be mine?" Whis was quiet for a long stretch. "Ain't about mine or yours. This place don't belong to people. It belongs to the ones who'll fight for it and keep fighting when there's nothing left to win." She didn't answer, but he caught the way her jaw set, not in defiance, but in understanding. Weeks turned into months. Maroro settled into the work like it was bone deep. Wise started finding her name penciled in the ledgers when cattle were tallied or supplies ordered. She'd begun walking the perimeter on her own boots, carrying the dust the way the widows once had. One morning, before the sun was fully up, Whis rode past the high pasture and saw her standing at the grave. She wasn't praying, she wasn't mourning, she was just there like the land itself had called her to bear witness. Later, over coffee, she asked him, "You ever think about leaving?" Whis shook his head. "Left too many places already. This one stuck." "That's how it starts," she said, and there was a faint, almost dangerous smile on her lips, not for him, but for herself. And in that moment, Whis knew the widow's fire, the one that had burned through war loss, and the stubborn bones of this county hadn't gone out with her. It had only shifted, finding a new shape, a new set of hands. Some inherit land, some inherit debt. But Maroro, like the widow before her, had inherited something heavier. She'd inherited the fight,